When I was 16 years old, I decided to surprise my parents with a bouquet of flowers for Valentine's Day. We've always celebrated this as a family holiday rather than a romantic one. I didn't have a car to drive to a florist, but my high school was within walking distance of a hospital, boasting a gift shop that sells floral arrangements. Between classes during the week of Valentine's Day, I set off for the hospital by my lonesome, cutting across campus to walk through a network of side roads, populated with specialty doctors' offices that keep odd hours, and the sort of buildings where traveling doctors mainly hold surgery consultations or perform small procedures a few times a month. The trip there passed without incident. As I was walking back through said deserted roads with a vase of flowers in tow, I noticed an unkempt 1990s car close behind me. While my memory of the car is hazy, I am left with the impression that there were at least two men within whose faces I could not see. Initially, I assumed that the driver was simply afraid of hitting me, the reason that they weren't passing by. So I made a point of dramatically trudging further into the grassy shoulder of the road, demonstrating to them that they could safely drive ahead. They still refused to pass me by, continuing to creep along behind at a slow pace. Beginning to suspect that the driver was more interested in me than a destination, I began to walk faster. The car confirmed my suspicions by matching my speed, despite the impracticality of my shoes and the threat of spilling water from my vase. I commenced to run as quickly as I could, but they hit the gas and they matched my speed. I realized at this point that the car was following me, that there was no place in sight to notice, and I needed to get away. I bolted into the first parking lot that I saw. The car turned in after me. And despite there being only 2 or 3 cars in the spacious front parking lot, and there being no other sign of activity at the office, this car did not stop to park in the numerous spaces available there. The driver instead opted to pursue me into this partially under construction back portion of the slot behind the office. It passed every available parking space to corner me against a pile of debris and rubble from the construction, coming to a diagonal stop less than 3 feet away. Before anyone could emerge from the vehicle, I somehow managed to scale the small prominence of rubble against my back, vase in hand, and I jumped from its peak to land painfully on the other side, which fortunately was a plot of undeveloped land with sight of my high school campus. I took a quick peek back over my shoulder to see if they were still in pursuit, but the car had sped off after I had reached the top of the rubble pile, and it was now nowhere in sight. They had not parked in the lot at all. They had no business there. The driver was following me. I sprinted at top speed, and didn't stop until I was soaked with sweat in the dead of winter, and panting in the student lounge among my classmates, who didn't seem to give a crap when I told them, possibly because our hometown is supposedly a trafficking capital, and the crime rate is outrageous. Although I am convinced that this was something more informal than trafficking, as the dilapidated car suggested poverty. And I've read trafficking usually arises through grooming and not being taken off the streets. In retrospect, I should have told an adult, alerted campus security, and called the non-emergency line of the local police station. But I was young, foolish, and insecure, and afraid of getting in trouble for leaving campus, when I didn't have a signed permission form permitting me to do so. I kept trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation, or that I was overreacting. I don't know what I would have even told the police had I called them, as I was entirely ignorant on the subject of cars, and couldn't have identified the make of it if I had been asked. and I couldn't see the faces of the occupants. I was also worried that my parents would restrict my already extremely limited freedoms if they knew that I'd been in danger. I feel horrible for having never told anyone, and honestly hope that my secrecy hasn't led to someone being hurt. I believe the only missing people aside from runaway children or elderly adults with dementia in the city right now, though, are men, aside from one woman a few decades ago. Whoever followed and tried to trap a 16-year-old with flowers at a doctor's office, what's wrong with you? This happened when I was 5 and my best friend was 6. A quick layout of our school. The building was L-shaped and the short end was not in use at the moment, and cars could stop to the right of the L, in full view or behind the short part, mostly obscured. The road was pretty much in a square around the school, but only in the aforementioned places cars could pull over. We were at school one day and she did something that had made me angry. She grabbed my colored pencil without asking. I wanted revenge. Shortly afterwards, recess had started, and about halfway through, I saw my best friend walking towards the back of the short building, and I followed her thinking that she was going to do something fun. When I rounded the corner, I saw a man in a car giving her candy through the open passenger door. Well, trying to. My childish mind thought, why doesn't that guy just step out to give the candy? Now he's holding it just outside her reach and she has to climb into the car to grab it, and his seat will get all dirty. My friend had one knee on the car seat, reaching for the candy now. I suddenly realized that this was the perfect time for my revenge. I would stop her from getting candy from this man. So I yelled at her that she wasn't allowed to be this close to the road. We would get in heaps of trouble if we were caught near the road instead of on the playground, and that I would tell on her. This caused her to jolt back, and she ran away from the car, back to the school playground, taunting me with the fact that a passerby thought she was so pretty that he wanted to give her candy but not to me. Apparently a teacher saw me walk towards the road and was on her way to fetch me. So she was just around the corner from us when my friend started taunting me. She heard what was said and quickly ran the last few steps towards us, frantically asking us, "Did anyone get in the car? Did you see any classmates get into the car?" She was clearly panicking and the car was long gone by now, having driven off when I yelled at my friend. My friend answered, "No, the nice man just wanted to give me candy, but she said that she would tell me, so we ran back. I really wanted that candy. Are we in trouble now?" The teacher escorted us inside, had all the other teachers count heads, everyone was there, and talked to the police that were called. Neither me nor my friend knew what was wrong at that time, until their parents came to fetch her and gave her a stern talking to about accepting candy from strangers, saying things like, "We've talked about this, and we have plenty of candy back home." My mom was proud of me because she thought that I had listened to the stranger danger talks and protected my friend. I didn't correct her. A few years ago, my best friend and I were talking about our old school, and this day came up. We both just realized that if I hadn't been so obsessed with those colorful pens, or if she had asked before taking them, that she could have been taken and suffered a pretty bad fate. She couldn't believe how stupid she was for thinking that a random guy would really offer candy to kids from his car, especially since her parents had warned her about strangers before. I just felt embarrassed for not recognizing the situation from the talks that my parents gave me, and being so focused on getting revenge. It took me a while longer to fully realize what could have happened to her. I don't know if the guy was ever arrested or did anything else, and after this incident, my school started permanently posting a teacher as a lookout near the road. As far as I know, there were no more incidents at that school, and it was never really spoken of again. The official reason for the lookout teacher was to prevent students from running out onto the road and getting run over. When I drove past last year, they had put a fence all around the school. I'm guessing it's because they finally realized a fence is cheaper than paying a teacher an hour a day to just stand around. So, when I was in high school, it was my senior year. I was 5'3", about 95 pounds. I was at a park down the street from my house, waiting for the school bus. Usually, my boyfriend, who was already graduated, would drive me to school, but he was busy. I later found out that he was cheating. Well, there was usually a few of us girls that were waiting there, but this day, I was the only one. So, I sat at the bench and had one headphone in, and one out so I could listen to my surroundings. I've always been cautious of what's going on around me. As I waited, a black Honda pulled up and I immediately noticed it. I kept an eye on it because I had a bad feeling about it. I wasn't making it obvious that I was watching it, because I didn't want to look crazy. But after a few minutes, two big men got out. I immediately texted my boyfriend that I was at the park and that these guys were creeping me out. Of course, he didn't text back, so I copy-pasted the same text to my cousin who was home. I lived with my aunt and two guy cousins, unwinding down from the night shift. I wanted someone to know the car make and color, plus it was two men. I didn't get any responses. When they got out of the car, they started to walk towards me. So I got up from the bench and I walked towards the street, because the bus was supposed to be there any minute. The driver actually ended up being a little bit late. As I stood there by the street, these men walked up to me and I could feel their bad energy. One guy said hello as the other stood there staring me down. I just gave them a small smile and a nod, and then I looked away. And then the same guy, I'll call him number one, asked how old I was. I didn't respond. I could tell the other guy, number two, was getting mad that I wasn't feeding into it. And then number one kept asking me yes or no questions, like, do you have a boyfriend? And do you live close? Do you do drugs? We have some, do you want some? And then number two asked me if I knew what the black market was. I felt a cold rush go over my body, and I got the chills. Number two, who was quiet the whole time, started to tell me that they just got back from Russia, but the way that he said it was so scary, almost intimidating. I knew they were from somewhere else because they had strong accents, but I couldn't pinpoint the place. They kept telling me to go to their car because they had drugs. I said no thank you. Trust me, I wasn't a straight edge in high school, but I wasn't stupid either. I would never get into somebody's car that I didn't know. And then number one came up to me and asked if I had a car. I said no and that my bus is almost here. Sorry, I gotta go. And by some sort of miracle, the bus rounded the corner and the guys backed off. They had been inching closer and closer as they had asked me questions. But before the bus got to me, number one handed me a card and said he has a car shop and to call him if I ever need anything. He even stated that he would give me a free car. The card looked shifty and I didn't want to grab it, but I knew that I needed that number on it to report it. And so I took it, and they walked off super fast. Finally, the bus stopped and it picked me up. As soon as I got on, I started to cry. I had a complete meltdown. It was like all of the adrenaline was keeping my mind and body aware and focused, while the men were there. But as soon as I was safe, My body and mind gave out. Thankfully, there weren't many people on the bus, so the driver calmed me down before we took off, and I explained to her what had happened. When she looked around for the car, they were gone. She said that she saw them around me, but thought that I knew them because they were so close to my person. The driver called into her dispatch saying that there is an incident, so that they could notify the school. She continued to pick up all of the other students, but when we got to the school, she walked me into the office. I was absolutely terrified to be alone. The principal came out and so did campus security. They were so sweet and gentle with me as they brought me back to the principal's office. Both were men and they proceeded to ask me questions about the men, their car, and the questions the creeps had asked me. I cried the whole time. And then I pulled out the card the guy gave me and I handed it to the principal. He looked at the security and said he was going to call them and act like my dad. And so he did. It was on speakerphone and number 1 answered. I knew his voice as if it was burned into my brain. It took everything in me not to have a panic attack. The principal asked the guy if he could get him a car at a good price, and the guy played dumb. The principal said that his daughter, me, gave him the card. As soon as he said that, the guy hung up. They tried calling again and the phone was shut off. Then eventually, it disconnected. I could see a shift in the principal and the security as soon as the phone had clicked. The security got on his phone and called the police, and they had them come to the school. It was as if they finally knew it was real, like my crazy story wasn't made up. The principal excused himself and the security guard, and they talked for a minute in the hall. I could hear everything that they were saying. She's lucky to be alive. This is serious. We need to call her parents to come get her. When the police got there, they came into the office that I was sitting in, and they asked me for the story again, and in front of the principal and security guard. I feel like they wanted to see if I was being 100% honest, so I obliged. The officers were straight up with me and told me it sounded like they were watching us girls at the park because they chose the one day that one of us were alone. He also said the card was being used as bait to get me to go where they had wanted. I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. The school called my aunt, but she didn't pick up. The only person that picked up first was my boyfriend. One of the officers talked to him, as the other finally got a hold of my aunt. My boyfriend ended up picking me up and taking me home, and I cried the whole time. When I got there, my grandma, uncle, aunt, mom, and cousins were all out front. The women were all in tears and the men were livid, but worried for me. A week later, some girl at another local high school not far from the park was saved by other students. She was being dragged into a black Honda by 2 guys. The other kids stood up and grabbed her and pulled her out of the car. The principal called me into his office, and that's how I found out. They also had the same officers there and had me choose the 2 guys out of a picture lineup. I pointed them out so fast, they were caught. It was in fact those 2 guys that tried grabbing the girl, a freshman girl. I felt worried for her instead that she went through worse than I did, and I felt almost free again. Still scared, but not looking over my shoulder as often. I couldn't believe they were caught. After that, my family teamed up to drive me to school for the rest of the year. My boyfriend, now ex-boyfriend, also took me some days. I'm thankful to be alive and well, and I'm even more thankful that that girl was also saved by the courageous kids at our high school. To give it some context, I was not wearing a very daring or revealing outfit. I had on a high-waist skirt and a crop top, but there was maybe 1 to 2 inches of my skin showing, maximum. It really was a normal outfit. I was waiting at the train station. The train was late as usual. Next to me on the bench, I see an old man reading a book that's handwritten in Russian. I actually thought that it was kind of cute. I didn't think much of it after that. We finally board the train, and the old man ends up sitting across from me. There was no one else in our little booth of 4 benches. The first 30 minutes or so go by without incident. He is reading his handwritten book, and I'm also reading a book and just playing on my phone. As we travel, the weather starts to get a bit rainy. After a while, the old man looks up and out the window. He looks at me and starts screaming and pointing out the window. At this point, I notice that he seems to be missing a part of his face around his eye, but I figured that he was old, so you don't stay in perfect shape. I am trying to understand what is happening. He is mostly screaming and not making much sense. I finally understand that he thinks I am the one who brought on the bad weather. I'm just sitting there, shocked, looking to the other passengers for help, and everyone is ignoring me. I turn to look at the man, and he is screaming that it is because of my shirt. I must have the devil inside of me, because no sane person would wear a crop top, obviously. I don't even say anything at this point. He stops screaming, and he turns a few pages in his book. He pulls out 2 crosses from his pocket, 1 in each hand, and holds them towards me and starts performing an exorcism. Parts in what I assumed was Latin, parts in Russian and German. He's leaning towards me, crosses in hand, opening and closing his eyes, screaming throughout the exorcism. I don't even know what to do at this point. I couldn't leave the train cart that we were in. Even if I got up, he would still see me or find me since it was pretty small. I debated going to hide in the bathroom, but I still had a good 50 minutes left in the train, and I was afraid that he would wait outside the door and hurt me as I eventually tried to leave the bathroom. So I sit there. He finishes his exorcism, seems to be content with it. He keeps telling me that I need to leave the country because the churches in Germany are crap, and I needed to go to a good church in Russia for a proper blessing. I nod and sit there. He reads his book. After another 10 minutes or so, he pulls out a card and he hands it to me. I look at it. It says his name in a photo and says that the holder of this card is severely mentally disabled. I'm thinking maybe that he had escaped from some facility somewhere. I couldn't get a good look at the name of the hospital. I just anxiously wait for the train ride to end. He says that he wants to follow me to make sure that I can keep the devil out. I say no, that it isn't necessary. He says that he will find me, that Frankfurt isn't a big city, and that he can still sense the devil in me, so he's afraid his exorcism didn't work properly. The train is pulling up to the station. He says that I should wait for him, and I say no, to which he says that it doesn't matter, because he is drawn to the evil inside of me. I get up, and as soon as the doors open, I run. I ran and ran and ran. At this point, I don't even know what my destination is. I just know that it needs to be as far away as possible. Eventually, I go into a big shopping mall, and I call the friend that I was meeting, who comes to join me. I never saw the man again. About 15 years ago, when I was 22-ish, my best girl and I went out to the bars 3 to 4 nights a week, and generally met some interesting people and made a few new friends. There were a few bars that we hit up more than others, and one in particular where we knew the bartender, the manager, pretty well. We had went the week of Halloween, and each night, their staff would dress up in a different costume. This is where we came across Ron. He was bouncing at this bar, and didn't even catch my eye in the slightest, as I gave him my ID to get in. Until a few years ago, I never looked anyone in the face. I have to force myself to do it. My girl and I hung out, drank and danced and met some people, and then headed up to the bar to chat with a friend. He asked me what I thought about Ron. I had no idea who he meant, and he gestured to the bouncer, to which I was like, meh. He was older looking, very muscular. He turned out to be a major gym rat. I was at 22-ish, dressed in black and skulls and platforms. Didn't seem my type on the outside, but the bartender friend vouched for him, said he was a really cool guy. He asked if he could give Ron my number, and I figured it would be okay. I hear from him the next day and he wants to hang out. At the time, I lived with my uncle and aunt, a pastor and his wife. So he invited me to meet at his place and we would just go have a casual hang somewhere. A simple, middle-of-the-day chill. I get there and his apartment door is wide open, and his much better looking, married and closer to my age friend is there. He seems nice enough, and I didn't feel unsafe as they left the door wide open, and again, my bartender friend had vouched for him. He mentioned that he needs to grab a few office supplies, so the three of us pile into his crappy car and headed to an office supply store. We go in, and as we walk in, a pretty girl walks by, and he does the head thing and completely stares at her, like the obvious follow her with his head thing. We aren't together, but I found it to be rude. So later in the car I mention it. I'd tell him, "Hey look, I know we're just hanging out, but don't disrespect me like that. Everyone looks, but be less obvious and don't make me look bad in public." He laughs and tells me that it's hot that I stood up for myself, especially on our first hangout. Okay, we get back to his place, and as we walk inside he says, "I like that. You're gonna have a ring on your finger by December. Remember, we met Halloween weekend." So anyway, his friend leaves. We get takeouts and we hang and drink and just talk. It turns out that he's from the same tiny town that my parents are from, which is 6 hours south of us. He is a Desert Storm veteran, which made him more than 20 years older than me, and he was back in school to finish his degree, worked full-time during the week, and bounced at night and on the weekends. Seemed decent. He asked about my tattoos. I have a lot. We talked about my love of horror and fascination with true crime and serial killers. He seems interested but says that he doesn't know much about them. So I tell him that I'll lend him my encyclopedia of serial killers, so it can be like a crash course for him. Maybe a week later we hang out again and I bring him the book. We hang multiple times and I even sleep there a few times. One day we were hanging out and day drinking heavily. He says something to me that felt very much like he was getting way too comfortable way too fast, like telling me to do something. I told him not to speak to me like that, and I turned to walk away when my head jerked back. He had grabbed me by my hair at the base of my neck. I grabbed his hand and he tried to laugh it off and apologize, saying that he didn't mean to be that rough and tried to act like it was some sort of foreplay, but I cut that off real quick. I wanted to leave, but I was already very buzzed. So I just sat there and he said that he was going to do some work. I thought that I would just let the buzz wear off, head home and never talk to this guy again. While I'm sitting and he's working, he suddenly decides to tell me in graphic detail about his favorite serial killer in the book so far and why. I think the way that he's talking about it seems off, but again, I'm just waiting out my buzz. He starts working on a homework assignment that is studying urban legends and such. He plays videos with horrible creepy content and it's creeping me out. I realized later that I felt that way because I didn't feel safe with him. I ask him to wait until I'm gone to play it out loud, or to put on headphones, and he laughs at me, tells me that he can't believe I'm such a poser. He tells me, "You have all these tattoos and skulls and really, you're scared. You look all goth and punk rock, but you're terrified." He laughs this scary laugh and he's really enjoying that. This creeps me out. I don't want to drive, even mildly buzzed. I tell him that his reaction is really scaring me. I love scary things, but I realize this guy is enjoying watching me be really uncomfortable, and he loves it. His face gets completely serious and he suddenly tells me that he has a machete under his mattress. I look and see the handle barely sticking out. He tells me that he can make me disappear, and nobody would ever find my body. In that moment, my adrenaline hit. I grabbed my bag and I ran to my car. He sort of slowly lumbered behind me, laughing at me and telling me not to leave. I am stone cold sober at this point. Adrenaline, I guess, and I start my car. I take off about 2 minutes down the road by the mall, then just park and slow my breathing down. I call my girl and I tell her everything. For the next week, he texts and calls me over and over, switching between begging me to give him another chance, berating me, calling me a poser and a fake. I tell our bartender friend and he can't believe that Ron did all of those things. He's only worked with him a few more times and they don't talk. Ron set his sights on someone new, another chick in her early 20s. Her family owns the Vietnamese restaurant in the same strip as the bar. The bartender tells us Ron had just started seeing her, and she ended up getting pregnant immediately. I asked the bartender to warn her or give her my number, but he never saw her again. I hope and pray that she didn't get stuck with Ron, and every time I'm in that area, I pray that I don't run into him again. He can keep the encyclopedia. I just hope that he hasn't picked up any tips from it. When I was a teenager, my parents were quite wealthy. My dad was a salesman for a high-end Chinese tech company, and he would always take trips overseas. There was one time that my mother chose to go with him. She had never been to China before, and there was some opportunity to get out of Hong Kong and experience the culture of the mainland. After a luxurious start to the vacation, my parents hopped in a plane and headed over to Shenzhen. Now, my mom is a pretty streetwise lady by US standards. She's managed to survive some pretty intense living conditions and navigate some bad parts of town well enough. So, I think she got incredibly arrogant here. At some point, when my dad was speaking with his superiors in a meeting, she asked if she could head out alone to do some shopping. My dad's boss was apprehensive and told her if she really wanted to take down his number in case anything happened. While shopping, she was lured to a back alley shop that sold a pretty diverse amount of designer knockoffs, bootleg DVD box sets, etc. I'm a huge TV fan, and apparently, she thought this would be a great opportunity to pick me up the first 5 seasons of Scrubs on DVD. It was nothing crazy. There are places like that all over China, but apparently she chose the wrong back alley shop. When she was finished making her purchase, a legitimate looking cab rolled up and offered her a ride. The cab ride was quiet, and it didn't take my mom too long to realize that something was wrong. The man wasn't driving her back where she came from, and I think he expected her not to have remembered the way to her hotel. There was a second man in the passenger seat with a stern look. The men spoke to each other in Chinese and did not acknowledge her when she spoke to them. They just kept driving. It took her less than half a mile before she tried to escape the car, but the doors were locked from the inside. The men then began yelling at her in Chinese and threatening her. They took her purse and removed the money inside of it and began talking among themselves. With one last resort, my mom called my dad's boss, who began speaking to them in Chinese via speakerphone. The men were scared almost immediately. They stopped the car, grabbed my mom and literally threw her out of the car into the street, and then they tossed the money at her. When she got back, she learned a few things. One, the money was counterfeit. They had kept the real money. Two, the men were a part of the Chinese Mafia. According to my dad's boss, people have a tendency to go missing in situations like that all the time, particularly tourists. He said that had she not made that phone call, she would have likely ended up in a very bad situation. The fake cab scam was actually quite a common method of doing this. And three, my dad's boss had some sort of questionable but scary pull among the criminal underground of mainland China. Or at least he knew how to put the fear of God into them. She still has no idea what he said to them. To this day, she gives me a lot of flack. Says that Scrubs box set nearly cost me my life. So, I had met a guy online. We talked for a day or two, but I was at the tail end of my degree, and things were getting to be a lot. So, I decided no dating until I was done. I let the handful of guys that seemed nice know before deleting the dating app, so they would know why I deleted it, and wouldn't think that I had ghosted because of them. He happened to be online when I sent it and said that I seemed cool, can we keep in touch? Sure, no worries, and I added him on Facebook. Maybe once a week he's like, hey, how are you? What are you up to? Just normal conversation stuff. I would chat about university, work, the gym, whatever. After maybe 2 to 3 months, he's like, hey, we've been chatting for a bit. Let's grab coffee. I'm like, yeah, sure, he seems nice enough. I reiterated it would be his friends and that was fine with him. I was about to head into exams, so we made plans for in 3 weeks' time after I had finished them. He had started messaging me more and more regularly after making plans, more than once a day, and he starts calling it a date, which people call catching up a coffee date without it meaning an actual date. But I wanted to make sure that we were still on the same page, so I just said, hey, you keep calling it a date, just making sure that we're clear it's just a catch-up as friends. He snapped. He was sending me all sorts of horrible things on Facebook, so I blocked him. I had given him my number so we could make plans, so he started calling and calling, leaving voicemails. It was late, so I put my phone on silent and I went to sleep. The next morning, I wake up to 37 missed calls and voicemails between 10 p.m., continuing until 4 a.m., as well as a multitude of horrible texts. Now, this was 7 years ago, when you couldn't just block someone on a phone. At first I thought if I ignored him, he would get bored. After about a week, he wasn't slowing down, with dozens of calls a day. I called my phone company to get him blocked, and they said that you can only block 3 people, are you sure? I had to jump through all the hoops and then they turned around and said that they couldn't do it, so I would have to call the police. So I called the police and they say that I have to call the phone company, but I can make a statement of harassment in case he does something more. 3 weeks later, he's still going strong, but in his text he starts saying he's going to force me to go on a date with him, and that I won't have a choice and blah blah. And then he starts saying that if I won't come to him, he'll come to me, and is telling me my schedule with where I will be at any given time, which he put together based on our weekly conversations about normal stuff, threatening to come to where I'll be. I had to stop doing my regular activities and pretty much become a hermit. He ended up making a threat to my life. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was essentially, "Girls like you get what they deserve," or something like that. But more clearly threatening, he would be the one to make it happen. I contacted the police again, and that was enough for an RVO, and I never heard from him again. Oh, and I was 20, but his pictures looked younger, so I didn't realize online, but it turned out this guy was 34. So this wasn't dumb young kid behavior. This was a grown man. I've had many other psychos since this guy, but I'm very grateful phones have since allowed you to block anyone, anytime.